In the final months of the Second World War, victory was only a word, and beneath its shadow, new wars were already being written. What the public celebrated as liberation, the intelligence services recorded as acquisition. Scientists, officers, and ideologues slipped through the cracks of surrender, escorted not to trial, but to contracts. Nations that had bled each other dry now competed in silence for the minds and machinery of the defeated. Beneath coded memos and sealed archives, the victors built their own empires of secrecy. This is not the history found in textbooks, but in the footnotes, the places where truth was deliberately erased. Chapter 1: Operation Paperclip, the Shadow Exodus. In May 1945, while Berlin lay in ashes and the world's headlines declared the fall of the Third Reich, a different kind of operation was already unfolding in occupied Germany. The Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, quietly began the extraction of hundreds of German scientists, engineers, and weapons specialists under a classified initiative codenamed Operation Overcast. Within weeks, that name was replaced with something cleaner, something that would sit better in future congressional hearings: Operation Paperclip. Each name was a cover, each file a sanitized truth. Officially, it was an act of national security to prevent the Soviets from seizing Nazi science. Unofficially, it was a transaction, immunity in exchange for innovation. The Americans established their first recruitment centers in the ruins of Nordhausen and Bleicher Road, the same facilities where prisoners from Dora Mittelbau had been worked to death constructing the V-2 rocket. Lieutenant Colonel James P. Hamill of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps was among the first to enter Peenemünde, where he met a tall, polite man named Werner von Braun. Von Braun spoke perfect English, offered a handshake, and claimed to have always dreamed of peaceful exploration of space. Behind that charm, however, were requisition forms bearing the signatures of SS overseers who ordered the execution of unproductive laborers. Those documents were quietly burned. Von Braun's personnel file was clipped with a paper tag, a literal paperclip, marking it for clearance and transfer. By late 1946, over 1,500 German specialists had been relocated to the United States under assumed identities. They were flown to ports in Antwerp and then shipped aboard army transports bound for Boston, New York, and Galveston. Many were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, where their research on long-range ballistic missiles resumed almost without interruption. The very weapon that had once reduced London to rubble now rose again, only this time with American flags on its fins. Official military documents referred to the effort as Project Hermes. Internally, intelligence officers had another name: Continuation Program. There were whispers in Washington that not all paperclip recruits were scientists. Among the names redacted in the War Department's official list were SS physicians associated with human experimentation programs in Dachau and Natzweiler. One such figure, identified in later declassified records as Dr. X231, specialized in high-altitude exposure testing. His transfer file, marked Cleared, Do Not Prosecute, bore the signature of a colonel from the Army Air Force's Medical Division. Decades later, fragments of his research appeared in US Air Force medical manuals on hypoxia. The victims who had provided the data were never acknowledged. Their contribution was rewritten as Field Results, European Theatre. In 1948, Senator Harley Kilgore quietly questioned the legality of these recruitments. His subcommittee on war crimes received an anonymous letter, later traced to a disillusioned OSS translator stationed in Frankfurt. The letter contained copies of German employment rosters, with names identical to those on American research payrolls. Kilgore demanded an investigation, but the case was smothered under the justification of Cold War exigency. The Soviet Union had already begun its own counterpart, Operation Osławiakim, seizing over 2,000 tons, German engineers and their families overnight, transporting them by train to secret research facilities near Moscow. In the ideological war for post-war supremacy, morality was expendable. Knowledge was not. Within 5 years, paperclip scientists had seeded nearly every corner of American military technology: jet propulsion at Wright Field, chemical engineering at Edgewood Arsenal, and guided missile systems under the Army's Redstone program. Von Braun's team, relocated to Huntsville, Alabama, worked under Army supervision, but reported directly to the newly formed Department of Defense. They lived in comfortable housing provided by the government, their SS records erased or rewritten. When the first American satellite, Explorer 1, was launched in 1958, von Braun stood smiling on the cover of Life magazine. Few remembered that only a decade earlier his rockets had fallen on civilians in Antwerp and London. The past had been successfully reclassified. What remained hidden were the missing files, those that disappeared between Peenemünde and Fort Bliss. In 1986, an archivist at the National Archives discovered a box labelled Miscellaneous Rocket Reports, 1945-1947. Inside were partially burned memos, handwritten in German, referencing Operation Morgenlicht, Morning Light, a supposed offshoot of the V2 program involving atmospheric payloads with biological components. One line, translated, read, "Test unit relocated under American protection. Data to be continued under new authority." The signature was illegible. When the archivist requested access to related microfilm reels, he was informed that the records had been permanently transferred to the Department of Energy. No such files were ever released. Even within the military, the ethics of paperclip were whispered about, but rarely confronted. A debrief report from the Counterintelligence Corps, dated 1951, described a former SS physicist expressing pride in his new country. "The Americans," he allegedly said, "are more pragmatic than the Reich ever was. They understand what power truly requires. Forgetting." That line was underlined in red pencil by the reviewing officer. In Germany, families of the victims from Dora Mittelbau petitioned the Allied Control Council for restitution. Their case was rejected on the grounds that the engineers responsible were now US nationals. No one was extradited. The factories where thousands had perished were converted into Allied testing facilities. The victims' graves were marked only by wooden crosses that later decayed in the forest soil. By the time paperclip was officially exposed in 1985 through the Freedom of Information Act, the Cold War was already thawing, and the men it had protected were either retired or dead. The press covered it briefly, calling it a moral compromise of wartime necessity. Few articles mentioned the sealed annexes that remained exempt from disclosure, annexes containing references to secondary transfers to Argentina, to South Africa, and to unnamed Pacific installations. The full scale of the operation was never admitted. What was sold to the public as the foundation of America's space program was, in reality, a network of sanitized sins. If you follow the paper trail, the original memos, the edited cables, the handwritten notes in OSS fieldbooks, a pattern emerges. The same agents who recruited von Braun also debriefed Nazi intelligence officers about Soviet infiltration. The same signatures appear on declassification orders for files concerning unexplained aerial phenomena. The same code phrase, continuation program, repeats across decades. It suggests that paperclip was never merely a mission to gather German science. It was the opening act of a global system of secrecy, born from the ashes of war and maintained under the justification of progress. To this day, much of the original paperclip documentation remains classified under national security exemptions. Historians estimate that over 80% of the names involved were never disclosed. The Defense Department maintains that all participants were vetted for war crimes and cleared. Yet testimonies from post-war intelligence officers tell another story. One of missing files, falsified birth records, and silent agreements made in smoke-filled rooms between men who believed the end justified any means. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is not written in stone monuments or textbooks, but in the coded language of defense budgets and research grants. In the end, paperclip was not about rockets. It was about survival, not of nations, but of knowledge. Knowledge that could not be destroyed, only transferred. When the Allied forces claimed victory, they did not end the war. They privatized it, and behind every triumph that followed, every launch, every experiment, every breakthrough, there remained an invisible signature, pressed in fading ink beneath the seal of Top Secret Paperclip. Chapter 2. The Vanished Convoy of the Arctic Route. The story of Convoy PQ-93 begins with a ghost in the ice. On February 8, 1944, a formation of 30 merchant ships, escorted by 6 Royal Navy destroyers and a single escort carrier, departed from Loch Ewe, Scotland, under a sky still bruised with northern twilight. Their mission was routine but perilous, to deliver fuel, munitions and classified cargo to the Soviet port of Murmansk under the terms of the Lend-Lease Agreement. Arctic convoys were always dangerous. U-boats prowled beneath the frozen seas, and Luftwaffe bombers from Banach and Kirkenes stalked them from above. But PQ-93 never arrived. Official records would later claim that the convoy was lost in severe weather somewhere north of Bear Island. No distress calls, no survivors, no wreckage, just silence, and a sequence of conflicting telegrams that made little sense to anyone who read them. Declassified. Naval logs decades later revealed that PQ-93's last recorded position was not in the Norwegian Sea, as claimed, but hundreds of miles west, near the Greenland ice shelf. The convoy, for reasons never explained, had deviated from its charted route. The Admiralty file, ADM 237 or 41, notes an intercepted transmission from HMS Vindex, the escort carrier assigned to air cover. Unknown contact transmitting on secure frequency. Phrase repeated. Iron Cross secured. Continue silence. The signal lasted 27 seconds, then stopped. Subsequent pages of the log are missing, replaced with the stamp Withdrawn for National Security, Section 4. In March 1944, Soviet liaison officers stationed in London began demanding updates on PQ-93's whereabouts. The British Foreign Office replied with carefully worded messages citing inclement weather and enemy activity. Yet, a secret memorandum from the War Cabinet, dated April 2nd, suggests that Stalin himself had issued personal orders for the convoy's protection. Why would a single convoy, one among dozens, matter so much to the Kremlin? The answer, hidden behind layers of classification, appears to be what the ships were carrying. In a requisition form labeled Scientific Equipment Restricted, 5 crates aboard the freighter SS Empire Crown were listed as property of the Ministry of Supply, consigned to the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Their contents: uranium oxide samples and associated apparatus. It was no secret that both the Allies and Axis powers were racing toward the atomic threshold. German intelligence had already established that the Americans were working on a superweapon through what they called Project America. Meanwhile, Allied signals intercepts at Bletchley Park confirmed that the Germans were attempting their own experiments with heavy water in Norway. PQ-93, it seems, was part of a covert exchange. The British transferring captured nuclear materials from the Norwegian front to Soviet laboratories, in a gesture of cooperation that would later become unmentionable in the early days of the Cold War. Yet something went catastrophically wrong. Weeks after PQ-93's disappearance, a reconnaissance flight from RAF Coastal Command reported sighting oil slicks and floating debris near Jan Mayen Island. Among them was an empty steel container marked with German stenciling, Reichspost Nr. 71284, Magneteinheit D. 6. The item was quietly collected and forwarded to a secure facility at Porton Down. The official report classified it as non-hazardous debris. Unofficially, a note scrawled by the examining officer read, "Not consistent with maritime cargo. Magnetic shielding suggests laboratory origin. The sample was never logged again. The Soviets conducted their own search under the supervision of Admiral Golovko of the Northern Fleet." In a telegram sent to Moscow on May 10th, Golovko reported, "Convoy PQ-93 likely intercepted by unknown surface vessel operating without transponder." He added a single cryptic line, "Enemy or ally unclear." That telegram was intercepted by British signals intelligence at Bletchley, but the translation was never shared with the Americans. Years later, fragments of this correspondence surfaced in the Churchill archives, cross-referenced with internal memos from the Joint Intelligence Committee discussing unauthorized interception of Soviet-bound assets. The phrase "Iron Cross secured" reappeared there, always redacted in the copies made available to researchers. By 1951, the mystery of PQ-93 had faded from public memory, replaced by newer crises: Korea, nuclear testing, the birth of NATO. But within the Admiralty's Submarine Warfare Division, a file labelled Arctic Route Incidents Closed continued to expand. Inside were reports from sonar surveys conducted by NATO during Operation Icecap in 1959. One document, stamped Secret, describes the discovery of anomalous metallic structures at a depth of 320 meters in the Greenland Sea, approximately 400 nautical miles from the convoy's supposed route. The shape of the wreckage did not match any known Allied or Axis vessel. The coordinates were immediately classified under the Omega Black security tier, used only for matters potentially compromising to Allied relations. Decades later, in 1977, a retired Soviet naval intelligence officer named Sergei Mikhailovich Orlov granted a rare interview to a Finnish journalist in Helsinki. Orlov claimed that the Soviet Navy had recovered a single lifeboat from PQ-93 in 1946, frozen into the ice off Franz Josef Land. Inside was the body of a British radio operator clutching a waterproof satchel. The documents inside were mostly illegible, but one contained a fragmentary message typed on Royal Navy stationery. Operation Starlight, cargo compromised, orders to divert to grid North 07. Orlov insisted the Soviets believed Starlight was a British codename for a nuclear collaboration. Within weeks of the interview, Orlov died of a reported stroke. The notes from that conversation were confiscated by Finnish intelligence and never released. Researchers who attempted to trace PQ-93's crew found another anomaly. The names of several merchant sailors appeared on subsequent shipping manifests dated after the convoy's disappearance. One even listed as serving on a tanker bound for Halifax in late 1944. When relatives were contacted in the 1980s, they confirmed receiving telegrams of death in service, but no bodies, no graves, and no explanations. The discrepancies suggested falsified records, possibly to cover for classified redeployments. If PQ-93 had been intercepted or redirected, its crew may have been silenced under official secrecy acts. One surviving Admiralty officer, interviewed anonymously in 1991, offered a chilling statement. "We were told PQ-93 never existed. That's how they bury these things. They erase the number, then the people, then the reason." His testimony aligned with notes from an internal US Navy review of Arctic convoy operations, which quietly omitted PQ-93 from the historical list. Between PQ-92 and PQ-94, there is a gap that no archivist can account for. What exactly was being moved under the Iron Cross Secured Directive? Some theorists believe it referred to a captured German prototype weapon, possibly nuclear materials seized from the Reichspost Research Division, which had worked alongside the Uran-Verein, Germany's atomic program. Others suspect it was not physical cargo, but personnel. Scientists extracted from occupied Norway, smuggled to the Soviets under a temporary alliance before Cold War hostilities began. In either case, PQ-93 carried something valuable enough for both sides to risk exposure and plausible enough to be erased afterward. In 2002, when NATO briefly opened portions of its Cold War archives, an unmarked microfilm was catalogued under the title Polar Operations 1944, Incident 93. The reel contained grainy images of wreckage beneath the Arctic ice, photographed by a submersible during a classified mapping mission. One frame shows what appears to be a fragment of hull plating, bearing both English and Cyrillic inscriptions. The reel was withdrawn within months and labelled misfiled material. The last verified document related to PQ-93 is dated September 12, 1945, and comes from the US Army Air Force's technical section. It reads, "Recovered debris of unknown origin delivered to Los Alamos under escort. Origin, North Atlantic." The report bears the initials JOC, believed to be those of Colonel James O. Carpenter, liaison for atomic materials transport. Nothing further was written about the matter. Today, the coordinates of PQ-93's final transmission are still classified under NATO Security Code Omega Black. No official recognition of the convoy's loss exists beyond a short entry in naval records marked cancelled movement, storm, conditions. But the silence itself tells a story. Somewhere beneath the Arctic ice lies a ship, or perhaps an entire convoy, carrying the weight of a secret that both East and West agreed to bury. The only trace that remains is that eerie phrase, captured once on a fading signal log and never heard again: Iron Cross secured. Continue silence. Chapter 3. Project Morningstar, the Ghost Files of Unit 731. When the guns fell silent over the Pacific in August 1945, not every document burned in the embers of Japan's surrender. Hidden among the ruins of Pingfang, Manchuria, lay what remained of Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's covert biological warfare division, responsible for human experimentation on thousands of civilians and prisoners of war. Officially, its facilities had been destroyed, its scientists executed or imprisoned. Yet within weeks of Japan's capitulation, American intelligence officers began arriving in Tokyo under orders from the US War Department's Technical Intelligence Unit. Their task was not prosecution, but acquisition. The operation bore a name never meant to reach daylight: Project Morningstar. In November 1945, a confidential memorandum from General Douglas, MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo, classified, top secret, Supreme Commander, eyes only, requested the immediate transfer of all epidemiological data obtained through field experimentation in occupied Manchuria. The document, signed by Colonel Murray Sanders of the US Army's Biological Warfare Division, acknowledged that the material originated from non-consensual experimentation. But Sanders' postscript contained the phrase that would define the moral collapse of the early Cold War. Information of this magnitude is of strategic value to the United States. No mention of criminality, no mention of justice. Only utility. Unit 731's commanding officer, General Shiro Ishii, vanished after the surrender. Official Japanese police reports listed him as missing, presumed dead. In reality, Ishii was living comfortably under American supervision in the suburbs of Tokyo, protected by the same officers tasked with investigating his crimes. By 1947, he was meeting regularly with representatives from Camp Detrick, Maryland, the headquarters of US biological warfare research. Among the delegation was Dr. Edwin Hill, a biochemist who later became one of the founders of the US Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases. Their discussions centered on weaponized anthrax, plague vectors, and frostbite survival experiments. The meeting minutes labeled Medical Collaboration Initiative Phase 1 were filed under the Morningstar codename and immediately sealed. Project Morningstar operated through front organizations disguised as medical exchange programs. One such entity, the Far East Epidemiological Research Bureau, established in 1948, was nominally run by Japanese doctors under US oversight. In reality, it was a funnel for data gathered during Unit 731's operations. Infection charts, autopsy notes, and tissue samples taken from Chinese and Soviet prisoners. The files were translated, indexed, and shipped to Fort Detrick in lead-lined containers marked Quarantine Research Material. A single cargo manifest from December 1948 lists human tissue samples, cold exposure series, weighing 73 kilograms. No further description was provided. The ethics of the project were buried under layers of classification. When questioned by the Allied War Crimes Tribunal, US representatives insisted there was no evidence of a coordinated biological weapons program by Japan. This was a lie, agreed upon at the highest levels. In exchange for full disclosure of his research, Ishii and his senior staff were granted immunity from prosecution. The deal was formalized in a secret annex to the US-Japan Joint Security Agreement of 1947. The existence of this annex was only confirmed decades later, when an unredacted version surfaced in a Freedom of Information release. It referenced Morningstar by name. By 1951, Morningstar's influence had spread beyond Asia. Several former Unit 731 scientists were quietly integrated into American research programs under assumed identities, echoing the methods used in Operation Paperclip. One such figure, codenamed Dr. N89, was later identified as Dr. Masaji Kitano, Deputy Director of Unit 731. Documents show he worked at a US Air Force laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, developing aerosol dispersal systems for crop sterilization agents. His employment records list him as technical consultant, civilian specialist. When a journalist inquired about Kitano's whereabouts in the 1970s, the Department of Defense responded simply, "No records found." Morningstar's activities continued into the Korean War. In 1952, Chinese and North Korean officials accused the United States of deploying biological weapons against civilian populations. The US government dismissed the allegations as communist propaganda. However, declassified intercepts from the National Security Agency, codenamed Project Silverleaf, show that high-ranking officers within the Pentagon were aware of field tests conducted by external advisors in the Korean theater. One report reads, "Application protocols consistent with data provided by former Japanese BW personnel." The attached photographs, grainy, black and white, depict what appear to be bombs marked with kanji characters. The originals were destroyed in 1969 under Presidential Directive 398A, Termination of Biological Programs. Within Japan, the ghosts of Morningstar were kept silent through intimidation and destruction of evidence. When former Unit 731 members attempted to speak publicly, they were silenced by a combination of social ostracism and official pressure. In 1962, a Japanese journalist named Masato Kaji published a serialized exposé in the Asahi Shimbun titled The Forgotten Unit. The series was abruptly discontinued after 3 installments. Kaji disappeared soon after, last seen boarding a train to Yokohama. His notes were confiscated by police and never returned. Among his papers, a single page survived, recovered years later from his widow's possession. It bore 3 handwritten words in English. Morningstar still active. The last known official document referencing Project Morningstar is a cable dated February 10, 1958. From the US Army Chemical Corps to the Pentagon's Research and Development Board, it reports the successful transfer of assets from Fort Detrick to an unnamed southern facility. Historians believe this referred to the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where biological field trials were later conducted. The same year, the Japanese government classified all surviving documentation on wartime medical research under its newly created State Secrets Act, effectively sealing the historical record for half a century. In 1984, a former intelligence analyst named Robert Kelton gave a sworn deposition to a congressional inquiry into unethical human testing. He testified that while stationed at Fort Detrick in the 1960s, he had overseen a storage vault labeled M-Star 731. Inside were glass jars containing biological samples, each marked with the Japanese character for test subject. Kelton claimed he was ordered to destroy them after a containment breach. The labels were written in Japanese, he said. Some had names. One said, Maruta 14. I was told that meant log. That's what they called people they experimented on. Today, the physical remnants of Morningstar are believed to be buried in 2 locations, an underground facility near Frederick, Maryland, and a sealed archive at Yokota Air Base in Japan. Both sites remain off-limits to researchers. The US Department of Defense officially denies the existence of any biological data exchange with former Japanese war criminals. Yet in internal budget reports from the 1950s, an unexplained line item appears under the heading Medical Data Acquisition, Pacific Theater. The amount allocated, $245,000, equivalent to millions today. The audit file is missing its supporting documents. Every so often, fragments of the truth resurface. A mislabeled file, a reference in an old report, a stray photograph in an academic paper. But each time the trail goes cold. Morningstar, like its name, rises only briefly before disappearing again into darkness. Its legacy is not measured in victories or defeats, but in the quiet normalization of compromise, the moment when nations decided that atrocities could be forgiven if they were scientifically useful. Somewhere in a locked government vault, a yellowing folder still bears the Project Morningstar seal. On the cover, in faded black ink, are 2 words underlined twice. Data complete. Below them, a final notation written in a different hand. Destruction postponed pending review. That review, 70 years later, has never taken place. Chapter 4. Echoes of Valkyrie. The Lost Conspiracy Tapes. Berlin, July 20th, 1944. At 12:42 p.m., a bomb detonated inside the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters near Rastenburg. The explosion killed 4 men, wounded many others, and very nearly changed the course of the war. The conspirators, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, believed the Führer dead. Within hours, Operation Valkyrie, the emergency plan intended to secure the Reich in the event of Hitler's death, was activated. But before the day ended, the coup had collapsed, its leaders executed, and history had recorded their failure in detail. Yet what those records did not include was the discovery, 3 decades later, of something that should not have existed. A series of unmarked magnetic tapes found beneath the ruins of a Gestapo outpost in Leipzig. The voices captured on those tapes would reawaken questions the Allies thought long buried. The chest containing the tapes was uncovered in 1972 during a municipal reconstruction project. Workers found it sealed inside a rusted filing cabinet, buried beneath a collapsed concrete wall. Inside were 12 reels, 2 damaged, and a set of brittle notes written in German shorthand. The case was quietly turned over to the East German Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. According to internal memoranda from the Hauptabteilung Weintutum, the recordings were initially dismissed as propaganda, but when audio technicians restored the first reel, what emerged was unmistakable: the voice of Colonel Stauffenberg himself. In conversation with at least 2 English speakers, their accents distinctly upper-class British. The dialogue was fragmented, but coherent enough to suggest that the Valkyrie conspirators were in direct contact with Allied intelligence prior to the assassination attempt. The Stasi codenamed the discovery Project Nachhol, Project Echo. Over the following months, analysts transcribed and translated the tapes. Among the voices identified were those of General Ludwig Beck, Karl Goerdeler, and an unidentified individual referred to by Stauffenberg as Mr. Harris. One passage, recorded on July 12, 1944, contained the words, "If your people ensure Berlin is not razed, our arrangement stands." To the Stasi, this suggested a covert Allied promise to recognize a post-Hitler provisional government if the assassination succeeded. It directly contradicted the official Allied policy of unconditional surrender, but the tapes contained even more disturbing hints that British intelligence may have had advanced knowledge of the plot and possibly supplied false assurances to manipulate its timing. When the existence of Project Nachhol reached the KGB, Moscow demanded immediate access. By then, the Cold War was in full swing, and any evidence of Western duplicity was invaluable. The reels were transported under armed guard to a classified archive in Potsdam, where Soviet audio specialists conducted their own examinations. Their report, declassified only in fragments after the Soviet collapse, confirms the presence of additional voices, American, not British. One man refers to Operation Foxton, a phrase absent from all known Allied records. Soviet archivists noted that the tape's magnetic composition was consistent with models used by the US Office of Strategic Services in late 1943. If true, it meant the recordings had been made not by the Gestapo, but by Allied handlers documenting their own communications. By the mid-1980s, the tapes had become the subject of internal East German political intrigue. A historian named Dr. Erika Lehmann, working as a consultant to the Ministry of Culture, was granted limited access for a planned exhibit on anti-Nazi resistance. Within weeks, she had vanished. Her apartment was found undisturbed, except for one missing item, a briefcase. A note discovered on her desk read only, "Echo Valkyrie, the real coup was not in Berlin." Shortly afterward, the project was officially shut down. The tapes were transferred to an unknown location and their existence erased from all Stasi inventories. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, not one of the original 12 reels was found in the archives. Still, fragments of Echo Valkyrie survived. In 1994, a private collector in Hamburg acquired a reel-to-reel labeled EV9 at an estate auction. When played, the recording contained approximately 7 minutes of faint, distorted audio. Amid the hiss and crackle, a male voice in English states, "Operation to proceed. London denies all involvement. Use Starlight confirmation only." The term Starlight later appeared in unrelated British intelligence files concerning covert communications between MI6 and resistance networks in occupied Europe. The connection was circumstantial yet chilling. If the British or Americans had indeed manipulated the conspirators, then the entire narrative of the July 20th plot, as history has understood it, was a carefully curated myth. There were, however, other interpretations. Some researchers proposed that the tapes were an elaborate Soviet forgery intended to sow discord among Western historians. Others pointed to inconsistencies in the tape, stock and language idioms that seemed too modern for 1944, yet even skeptics could not explain the cross-reference details found in unrelated wartime communications. One British naval log dated July 18, 1944, recorded a message from an attached diplomatic courier requesting confirmation of V-person readiness. Historians now suspect V-person referred to Valkyrie. The authenticity of the log has been verified. Further intrigue came from an obscure OSS debriefing file discovered at the US National Archives in 2004. It described a failed attempt to extract friendly German officers from neutral Sweden in August 1944, weeks after the Valkyrie plot failed. The file listed the operation leader as Major William Harrington, OSS liaison to MI6, his code designation HRS-3. The same initials, HRS, appeared in the Stasi transcript as Mr. Harris. The circumstantial overlap was impossible to ignore. The logical conclusion: the man known to Stauffenberg as Harris had been a real operative. The more historians uncovered, the less clear the story became. If the Allies had indeed orchestrated contact with German resistance leaders, why allow them to fail? One theory holds that by July 1944, the Allies preferred a total collapse of the Nazi regime to a negotiated peace with conservative officers. Another suggests that the coup was encouraged solely to gather intelligence on Germany's internal security apparatus, an operation designed to expose the opposition rather than aid it. In this light, the Echo Valkyrie tapes represent not evidence of collaboration, but of manipulation, proof that the resistance was sacrificed as a pawn in a larger geopolitical game. In the late 1990s, a British journalist named Andrew Mallory obtained declassified Foreign Office correspondence from 1945 containing veiled references to the Leipzig matter. One letter, written by a senior diplomat, reads, "The items recovered in the eastern sector are to remain suppressed indefinitely. The integrity of the record outweighs the curiosity of posterity." Attached was a typed note bearing an unfamiliar classification mark. Foxden, do not reopen. Mallory's subsequent request for further information under the Public Records Act was denied on national security grounds. He died of a sudden heart attack 6 months later. His research files disappeared from his home. Today, no confirmed copy of the Valkyrie tapes exists. What remains are fragments of transcripts, official denials, and persistent rumors that a duplicate set was smuggled to the West before the fall of East Germany. Some claim that a single reel, labeled EV1, resides in a private collection somewhere in Switzerland. Others insist the tapes were quietly acquired by Western intelligence in the 1990s and remain locked in a NATO archive. In either case, the public record of the July 20th plot is likely incomplete, shaped by the victors, filtered through secrecy, and preserved only where convenient. The tragedy of Echo Valkyrie lies not in what it proves, but in what it implies, that even the most courageous acts of defiance can be co-opted, recorded and repurposed for unseen agendas. History remembers Stauffenberg as the man who tried to kill Hitler. It forgets the possibility that his allies were listening, guiding, perhaps even deceiving him from afar. And somewhere, in a locked vault or a forgotten attic, a spool of fragile magnetic tape may still hold the true voice of that betrayal, hissing, faint, but unmistakably alive. Chapter 5. The Black Vaults of Peenemünde. April 1945. As Soviet tanks advanced through Pomerania, the German missile research facility at Peenemünde was ordered evacuated. For years, the site had been the heart of the Reich's most ambitious technological endeavor, the development of the Vergeltungswaffe, the vengeance weapons. These rockets, the V1 and V2, were meant to turn the tide of war through terror and precision. What history records is that the Allies captured the scientists and scattered the remnants of their work. What remains untold is what both sides found buried beneath the sand dunes and launch pads, and why the records of those discoveries were immediately classified under code name Schwarzgewölbe. The Black Vaults. When British forces reached Peenemünde in May 1945, they discovered more than missile debris. A Royal Engineers report, recovered decades later, describes underground storage chambers accessible through partially collapsed ventilation shafts. Inside were sealed iron crates stamped with the insignia of the Heeresversuchsanstalt, the Army Research Center. Most contained tools, blueprints, and test components, but a few bore strange markings. A thunderbolt through a spiral, accompanied by the words, Project Thor. The crates were removed under armed escort and shipped to an undisclosed facility in Antwerp before being divided between British and American technical teams. The inventory list that accompanied them was heavily censored, with entire lines blacked out. The surviving legible entries mention electrogravitic propulsion, high-voltage containment units, and plasma magnetics. The Soviets, arriving days later, found their own trove. In a report by NKVD officer Major Ivan Serov, dated June 1945, Peenemünde's subterranean labs were described as partially flooded yet intact. Serov recorded the discovery of rotating metallic discs connected to central turbine assemblies. He speculated that they were related to advanced gyroscopic control systems for rockets. But one note, written in Serov's hand, hints at something more unsettling. These are not missiles. These are field generators. Germans call them Die Glocke prototypes. Within months, Serov's full report was sealed under Stalin's direct orders. Extracts were later sent to the Soviet Design Bureau in Kaliningrad, sparking a classified program called Znamya 210, an effort to replicate whatever had been found. Meanwhile, the Western Allies established Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe secret technology, charged with collecting and analyzing captured German research. Most of the findings were sent to Wright Field in Ohio and White Sands in New Mexico, joining the troves of Operation Paperclip. Yet among the thousands of recovered documents, there is a consistent reference to a missing annex, Annex E12, Peenemünde Vault Documentation. It was reported lost in transit in 1946 after an accident involving a transport aircraft over the North Sea. No wreckage was ever found. The same year, US Army intelligence created a special classification tier, Non-Conventional Research, Category X, which, according to a 1952 debriefing memo, contained select material of uncertain origin or replicability recovered from the European theatre. The memo mentions Peenemünde by name. By 1949, fragments of the Project Thor blueprints began circulating among Allied scientific circles. They described a propulsion system that appeared to utilize magnetic containment rather than chemical combustion, an idea decades ahead of its time. A former engineer from the British Inter-Services Research Bureau later recalled, "It looked like a cross between a turbine and a particle accelerator, but the math didn't match known physics." These designs, if authentic, suggested that Germany had been experimenting with high-energy plasma fields, technology that would not be openly explored until the 1960s. Yet every attempt to replicate the work reportedly failed, often resulting in unexplained power surges or equipment damage. In one case, a test at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough caused an entire substation to overload, blacking out the facility for hours. Soviet archives reveal a parallel obsession. From 1946 onward, captured German scientists were relocated to a site near Gorodomlia Island under Operation Osoaviakim. Among them were engineers who had worked on Peenemunde's power systems. When questioned about Project Thor, they denied all knowledge, claiming the term referred to a myth invented by SS officers. Yet in a letter dated November 1947, Soviet physicist Anatoly Alexandrov wrote to Lavrenti Beria describing anomalous effects observed in rotational plasma systems of Peenemünde origin. The letter was marked for Stalin's review and archived under Cosmos Division, restricted. It remains classified to this day. Western intelligence continued to chase the mystery. A 1957 CIA field report from Bonn, titled Residual Technologies of the Reich, references rumors of missing Peenemünde vault materials smuggled to Argentina aboard U-977, one of the last German submarines to surrender. The same document cites an informant claiming to have seen sealed canisters bearing Peenemünde labels unloaded near Mar del Plata. Argentine naval archives, however, make no mention of such cargo. Whether true or a convenient myth, these stories fueled decades of speculation about Nazi superweapons escaping justice and research continuing in exile. During the height of the Cold War, references to Peenemunde's black vaults resurfaced in American defense circles. In 1963, a classified RAND Corporation briefing titled Electrostatic Field Dynamics, Historical Review included a single slide citing recovered German field containment studies, Peenemünde Series, Category X, 1945. The slide was removed in later editions. A year later, a US Air Force contractor, Dr. Kurt DeBus, once a Peenemünde engineer and now director at Cape Canaveral, requested clearance to review vault material, E12 subset. His request was denied. The notation on the denial reads simply, access exceeds clearance authority. Material archived per NSCID 9A. Eyewitnesses who worked at Peenemünde after the war described being warned not to discuss certain sections of the facility. Former British Army sapper Harold Finch recalled entering a sealed tunnel in 1946, where the walls were lined with vitrified rock. It was as if the concrete had melted, he said in a 1992 interview. I've seen bomb damage. This wasn't that. It looked like something had burned from the inside out. He and his team were ordered out immediately, and their field notes confiscated by American officers the next morning. Finch's account is supported by a fragment of an after-action report found in the Imperial War Museum, noting subsurface anomalies consistent with Electromagnetic discharge, the final confirmed mention of the Black Vaults, comes from a British intelligence summary dated 1952. Remaining materials from Peenemünde transferred to NATO research group under Directive Omega. Black. This classification was the highest secrecy level reserved for information considered potentially destabilizing to geopolitical balance. The Omega Black tier appears again in later documents related to both nuclear propulsion and anti-radar systems. Whether these technologies were derived from the same source remains uncertain. Modern researchers attempting to locate the vault site face sealed archives and erased records. Satellite imaging of Peenemünde shows unexplained subsurface cavities extending beneath the Baltic shoreline, structures not present on wartime maps. Local divers claim to have found collapsed tunnels leading seaward, now flooded and inaccessible. The German government acknowledges only that industrial waste was disposed of in the area after the war. Independent expeditions have been denied permits due to environmental safety concerns. Whatever the truth, the story of Peenemunde's Black Vaults is more than an episode of technological ambition. It is a window into how far men will go to control the secrets of power. Both the East and West profited from the legacy of the site, each building their space programs and weapons research upon its ashes. But in the shadows of those triumphs lies an unspoken lineage. Experiments erased from the official record, sealed behind vault doors, and protected by bureaucratic silence. In a declassified memorandum from 1978, an unnamed NATO scientist summarized it best. What was buried at Peenemünde was not just the machinery of war, but the evidence that we never stopped it. We only changed its form. And beneath the Baltic dunes, in chambers still locked by rusted steel and the weight of secrecy, the echoes of Project Thor wait, silent and unacknowledged, a relic of a war that never truly ended. The archive is never closed. For every document declassified, another is redacted, reburied, or quietly destroyed. Files vanish, witnesses die, and what remains becomes history's shadow, a version edited for comfort. Yet scattered among the surviving fragments are hints of something larger, an unbroken thread connecting Peenemunde's vaults, Valkyrie's lost tapes, and the ghost networks of paperclip. Nations built their futures upon secrets they swore never existed, and the truth still seeps through the cracks. Somewhere in the classified corridors of Washington, Moscow, or Berlin, the last pages of this war wait, sealed in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right question.